And welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement here at JTS, and I'm so happy to welcome you to today's post-President's Day session of our spring series, although it doesn't feel too springy in the New York area, and I hear it doesn't feel too springy in California either, but anyway, it's still a spring series. The space in between thresholds and borders in Jewish life and thought. Special welcome to anyone joining us for the first time today. And we're very pleased to have Dr. Sarah Wolf, who is Assistant Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at JTS, teaching us today. And this session sort of goes into the philosophical and thinking about kind of the nature of our religion, the nature of our text. And we're exploring the question of law versus narrative, or law and narrative, and is there a border, is there a threshold? So we're really looking forward to that exploration with Professor Wolf. And I wanted to also let you know, if you're here especially to hear Dr. Wolf, or if you're simply interested in this kind of exploring these kinds of questions through rabbinic texts in particular, that Dr. Wolf is teaching a new online course that's going to slot in between Purim and Pesach. So it's going to be Mondays starting at 7 p.m. Eastern time, 4 Mondays from March 13th to April 3rd. And the topic is mitzvot, obligation in Jewish thought, looking at what does it mean to value religious obligation in a world and a worldview where we lift up free choice and individual rights. So Professor Wolf is going to be looking at sources, both classical and contemporary, on commandedness, and looking at the tensions there between those competing values. So I hope some of you will join us for that. We also want to invite folks to consider sponsoring one of these webinars. We have 3 sponsorship levels. There's a link being posted in the chat, and all of your gifts, both your other gifts, but especially sponsorship gifts, really make this series possible. So we'd love for some of you to consider sponsoring for the first time. All right. So on that note, before we begin our content, I'll turn things over to Tani Schwartz-Herman for a couple of instructions.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to review the format of our session, Professor Wolf will pause for questions periodically throughout our session, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. You can chat your questions to Rabbi Andelman, and she'll select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Wolf. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link this morning. We'll be screen sharing them as well. Please introduce Dr. Sarah Wolf, Assistant Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at JTS. Dr. Wolf's current book project examines the construction of emotions as legal categories in rabbinic literature. Dr. Wolf is also a faculty member at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Wolf.
Thank you so much. Law wears a frown, narrative a smile. The one is pedantic, severe, unbending, all justice. The other is accommodating, lenient, pliable, all mercy. The one commands and knows no halfway house. Her yea is yea and her nay is nay. The other advises and takes account of human limitations. She admits something between yea and nay. The one is concerned with the shell, with the body, with actions. The other with the kernel, with the soul, with intentions. On one side, there is petrified observance, duty, subjection. On the other, perpetual rejuvenation, liberty, free volition. This is the opening paragraph of a classic essay by the Jewish literary giant Chaim Nachman Bialik, except that instead of the words law wears a frown, narrative a smile, Bialik uses the words halakhah and aggadah, which is also the title Bialik uses for the essay, and which are categories I'll be using today in my talk, halakhah, which I'm sort of provisionally translating as law, and aggadah, meaning narrative. In this paragraph, Bialik is describing what has classically been understood as a dichotomy between two Jewish modes of thinking and writing. And Bialik kind of sets up an almost exaggerated dichotomy between the two, where halakhah, law, is about justice, commands, actions, petrified observance, he says, right? Something that is not just about the law, but is in some way sort of detached from everyday reality, whereas aggadah, narrative, Bialik argues, is about humanity, about intentions, about nuance and complexity. Clearly, right, Bialik is on the side of aggadah, of narrative in his framing. But ultimately, Bialik winds up arguing in his essay, Halakhah and Aggadah, that the two genres are, as he puts it, two sides of the same coin. And Bialik also winds up co-publishing in the early 20th century a work called Sefer HaAggadah, the Book of Legends, which is a compilation of many of the texts that have typically been considered to fall in this category of Jewish narrative. So why does Bialik, in his essay, want to make this argument that despite their apparent dichotomous nature, halakhah and aggadah are actually more related, more connected than people think? And why does he need to argue in favor of aggadah? Why does Bialik need to reclaim aggadah, narrative, as worthy of our attention, worthy of its own compilation? So historically, the distinction between halakhah and aggadah, law and narrative, in Jewish texts really begins as a way of distinguishing between different types of passages in the Babylonian Talmud, in the Bavli. That is the root of this sort of genre distinction that has persisted throughout many, many centuries. And that origin of this distinction between law and narrative in the Bavli is really what I'm going to be focusing on for much of this talk, because that's really where it comes from. And that's, I think, also where it can begin to be problematized. And so before we continue, I just want to give people a few minutes of context about what we're talking about when we talk about the Bavli, about the Babylonian Talmud, what kind of text it is in general, how it was compiled, and why readers of the Talmud might have felt the need to categorize different types of texts that are in it. So the Bavli was compiled between the 3rd and approximately 6th or 7th centuries of the Common Era in Bavel, also known as the Sasanian Empire or the Neo-Persian Empire, the area of the world that is today Iran and Iraq. Like all rabbinic literature that was compiled in late antiquity, it was originally an oral text. To sort of give a quick synopsis of a pretty complicated and large body of work, the Bavli is essentially organized around the Mishnah, which is an earlier code of law. But the Bavli also contains, in addition to sort of commenting on, analyzing this earlier law code of the Mishnah, many, many, many other types of discourse. So there is legal analysis of the Mishnah in the Babylonian Talmud. There's also dream interpretation. There's also folk wisdom. There's also analysis of biblical stories. And there's also lengthy narratives about rabbis getting up to all sorts of adventures. Really, the Bavli is just this amalgam. Scholars often call the Bavli a kind of anthology of everything. And one thing to note about the Babylonian Talmud, which, as I mentioned, is sort of this text from the later part of late antiquity that's being composed in the Sasanian Empire, is that there's also other works of rabbinic literature, including the Mishnah, that were composed earlier in Roman Palestine, in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so if folks have heard of, in addition to the Babylonian Talmud, there's also something that's called the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Palestinian Talmud, which was composed earlier in Roman Palestine. And one of the things that makes the Talmud Yerushalmi different from the Talmud Bavli is the Talmud Yerushalmi is much, 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 much shorter. The Talmud Bavli contains all of these different genres, all of these different discourses. The Yerushalmi has just much less content. And one of the differences in general between the rabbinic literature of Eretz Yisrael and the rabbinic literature of Bavel is that the so-called bookshelf of Eretz Yisrael, and again, bookshelf is in quotes because all these texts are being produced orally, but the rabbis who live in Eretz Yisrael are producing different compilations of texts in different genres. So the rabbis in Eretz Yisrael produce separate compilations of what is called midrash, or biblical interpretation. They also produce collections of texts like the Mishnah, which are law codes. They also produce the text, which is the Talmud, which is this sort of analysis of the Mishnah plus. The rabbis of Bavel only produce the Babylonian Talmud. That is the work into which they put every single piece of learning, thinking, discussion, analysis, story, interpretation that they have. It's all being wrapped up together within the Bavli, which is why the Bavli is so much longer than the Yerushalmi, than the Talmud being produced in Eretz Yisrael. Everything is going in it. And so what we have then already is this sense of the Babylonian Talmud, the Bavli, as this kind of amalgam that might inspire people to start to think about, okay, but are there different types of texts that are being contained within the Bavli, just as we know that we have different types of texts that were actually being produced and compiled separately, right, in Eretz Yisrael, in Roman Palestine. So both the rabbis of Bavel and the rabbis of Eretz Yisrael refer to something called aggadah, right, what we're translating as narrative, as a mode of learning. The text of the Talmud itself makes reference to something called aggadah, and it also makes reference to something called Talmud as a type of study, but no rabbinic work ever explicitly characterizes itself as a work of aggadah. Okay, the category of aggadah to refer to texts within the Talmud is actually a category that was invented later. It's not a category that is native to the Talmud, right? The Talmud never says, here comes aggadah, blah, 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 right? It's being ascribed to Talmudic texts by the group of rabbis who immediately followed the production of the Talmud, the heads of the yeshivot in Babylonia, known as the Geonim, the great ones. And in some ways, the ascription of this category to texts in the Talmud makes sense, right? The Talmud does contain this amalgam of genres. Sometimes it focuses on arguments about legal minutia, and sometimes it goes into these lengthy narratives about rabbis and their crazy adventures. For example, the story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai escaping from the besieged city of Jerusalem in a coffin and negotiating with Emperor Vespasian for the establishment of the Rabbinic Center of Learning at Yavne, right? This is a classic long narrative from the Babylonian Talmud. There's the story of two rabbis, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, who meet while bathing in a river and become entangled in a tragic and debatably platonic relationship, right? These are the kinds of stories that people have classified as aggadah. They're so different, it seems, to readers of the Talmud than right, the kinds of conversations that when people in just sort of dialect talk about things being Talmudic, right? Usually they're not talking about them involving long, interesting stories. They're talking about really these very technical legal argumentations about very specific details, right? It seems to readers of the Talmud, understandably, that there's a huge difference between these kinds of stories and these kinds of arguments. And so the question that we're going to focus on today is how far this distinction can and should be taken, right? Granted that there are texts in the Talmud that really seem to be on sort of different sides of this spectrum. Are all texts in the Bavli categorizable in one of these two compartments? Should they be? And what possibilities are opened up for us when we start to think of the divide between law and narrative in the Talmud, but also in the rest of the Jewish canon, as maybe somewhat more fluid than we tend to imagine? So what I'm going to try to show you today through some close readings of passages from the Babylonian Talmud is that halakhah and aggadah are not just two sides of the same shield, as Bialik and some more contemporary scholars have claimed, but that the Talmud actually contains many passages that really sit with a foot in each category. And I'm going to suggest that the existence of such passages that really are in this liminal in-between place between halakhah and aggadah can offer some fruitful options for how Jews today can engage with the Talmud and with the Jewish textual canon as a whole. Okay, so what I'm going to do is first, I'm going to just give you a little overview of the reception of this halakhah and aggadah distinction, meaning what happened kind of in Jewish history, how this distinction has persisted in terms of Jewish life and learning spaces. And then we're going to jump into our text from the Bavli. We're going to get technical and we're going to dive into some Talmudic texts that seem to blur the boundaries. First, we're going to look at a narrative, a story that despite its narrative structure, also speaks to some legal concerns. And then we're going to speak to some of these legal argumentative passages, the passages that are more classically characterized as halakhah, that we'll see are actually structured in literary ways. And then I'll close by just suggesting some contemporary takeaways for moving beyond the law versus literature dichotomy in our read of the Jewish canon. Okay, so to start with, what happens with this distinction? I mentioned it's sort of created by the heads of these Babylonian academies in the period immediately after the Talmud's formation. And then what happens to this distinction? So first of all, One thing that's really interesting about how this distinction is invented and the way in which it's been sort of received or understood is that traditionally halakhah is understood to mean law, right? And to refer to legal codes or arguments. But actually, even though I have just been treating aggadah and narrative as synonymous, the definition of aggadah has never been totally clear. Basically, scholars have treated anything that can't be labeled as halakhah, as law, as aggadah. Okay, so that includes these long narratives, but it can also include some of these other genres, these other types of texts in the Bavli that I mentioned, like dream interpretations, folk wisdoms, right? Remedies for different ailments. All of these are actually very much present in the Babylonian Talmud. All of this stuff, right, that doesn't count as legal literature gets kind of classified by readers of the Talmud as aggadah. But narrativity, right, the sort of literary quality of telling a story has become associated with aggadah, right? Both because lots of the non-legal literature really is narratives, and also because, right, the legal texts have tended to be thought of as not so narrative. And so narrative then becomes really heavily associated with aggadah. I also want to just mention a third term, which often I think gets conflated with aggadah, which is midrash. And I just want to briefly explain why midrash means something a little different than aggadah and why I'm mostly not going to be using that category when I'm referring to these two sort of types of texts in the rest of my talk. So what midrash really means on a more like technical level is any kind of biblical interpretation. Now, that biblical interpretation could tell a story. It could be in the form of a story. Sometimes it is. But actually, a lot of rabbinic biblical interpretation does not really take a particularly narrative form. And this is a topic really for a whole other talk, but I'll just, to make things extra complicated, there's actually considered to be two different genres of midrash, one that is called midrash halakhah and one that is called midrash aggadah. Okay, so right, the first type of midrash is the midrash halakhah is about legal texts in the Bible, and uses very specific sort of reading techniques of different words in the Torah, often to generate new legal principles. Midrash aggadah, on the other hand, takes a different format. It's more kind of homiletical. It probably was actually used in sort of a synagogue sermon context, and it's got more of a sort of literary style. Okay, so there's actually midrash that kind of falls into both of these categories. So just wanted to, I sort of am anticipating that as a possible question, so just wanted to frame that before we go any further. But what I want you to know about the existence of the halakhah and aggadah categories, both for the categorization of different kinds of midrash, but also for the categorization of texts that are in the Babylonian Talmud, is that the halachic portions, the legal portions, have really been privileged since the Gaonic period, since the period immediately following the close of the Talmud. The Gaonim, these rabbis who were the heads of the Babylonian academies, established the Talmud as their source for practical law, right? So when Jews in Bavel would write to these rabbis asking them legal questions, they ruled based on the Talmud. But they actually established, and they wrote this explicitly in their letters to their sort of Jewish constituents, asking them legal questions. Ein lomdin min ha'aggadah. We don't learn practical law from aggadah. It's only the halakhah that is going to be relevant, according to these rabbis, in deciding matters of practical law. We're not going to pay attention to what they considered to be the non-legal material of the Talmud, not from the stories, right? Not from sort of these more homiletical pieces, only from what they consider to be straight up law, straight up halakhah, okay? And so when they compile these, the first sort of codes of Jewish law, they are following the text of the Talmud, but what they're really focusing on are what they categorize as the halachic portions, the legal portions. Because they're considered to not be practically relevant, the other portions tend to be a bit ignored. And this privileging of halakhah continues through the medieval period. There's a digest produced by a rabbi named Yitzchak Alfasi, the Rif, called Hilchot, which is it's a sort of digest of the Babylonian Talmud, but again, only focusing on the halachic parts. Arguably, Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, the Rambam's Mishneh Torah, also continues to privilege the halachic sections of the Talmud by positioning itself as basically a suitable replacement for all of rabbinic literature. All you need to know about rabbinic literature, the Rambam claims, is in the Mishneh Torah, but it's all law. It's all the law code. Again, none of the non-legal portions of the Babylonian Talmud make it into Maimonides' law code, right? Presumably because they're considered to be there, but not so important for the study curriculum. There are, in the 15th century, there are some digests of the Bavli's non-legal work that are produced. The most famous one, I think, is Ein Yaakov, which my colleague, Dr. Marjorie Lehman, has written about, which is a compilation of all of the considered aggadah, narrative portions of the Bavli, but it never really becomes particularly valued or significant in the Jewish study curriculum, right? The Ein Yaakov, this compilation of aggadah, is sort of considered to be for like a lay audience who can't really manage to study the halachic portions of the text. This is not what I'm saying. I'm just describing what people in the Middle Ages thought about the difference between halakhah and aggadah. And I'll just say, since then, this dichotomy has only become more and more entrenched. The traditional study of Talmud in Eastern European yeshivot, and even in the United States, has developed all these different rigorous methodologies for studying Talmudic halacha, and the aggadah has been relatively unstudied and unprivileged. Okay, so when Bialik is making a case for aggadah as beautiful and important and connected to halacha, and going ahead and publishing his own book that is a compilation of aggadah, he's really responding to a major cultural trend through hundreds of years of Jewish history, not to pay attention to the aggadah, to consider it as something that is both separate from halacha and unimportant. I'll just say this has changed to some extent in the 20th century as a result of several factors, one of which is the turn in the world of the academy in the 1980s to put rabbinic literature, especially midrash, in conversation with literary theory. And this approach really opened the door for non-legal rabbinic texts and rabbinic texts that actually were more literarily, more narratively rich to receive serious study, at least in the Western academy, if not in the yeshiva. And then the other sort of big move that happens in the 20th century, totally outside the world of Jewish thought or study, is the law and literature movement in the humanities. The forefather of this movement, who was a law professor at Yale, Robert Cover, also happened to be a committed Jew. And he argues for a deep interrelationship between law and narrative in the world and in the American sort of development of our culture and our legal system. And this begins to make its way into the academy. And this starts to push scholars also not just to give serious attention to midrash and narrative in rabbinic literature, but to really start to describe halakhah and aggadah as being more in conversation with each other than had previously been understood. So one important example of this approach, full disclosure, is from my own doctoral advisor, Barry Wimpheimer, who wrote a book called Narrating the Law, which I'll be drawing from to some extent in the first set of texts we're going to be looking at in this talk. And Wimpheimer basically reveals that there is a category of Talmudic texts which he calls legal narratives. And he defines legal narratives as a subset of Talmudic texts that take a story form but have legal content, and that they reveal the aspects of rabbinic law that are messy and actually not necessarily expressible in the form of a statute or a code. Wimpheimer still is sort of committed to the idea that there are these kind of different discourses still in the Talmud, that right, there is sort of a legal systematizing voice in the Talmud and a narrative voice that are to some extent in tension. And so I also want to suggest, and this is going to be the second set of texts that we look at, that even the Talmud's more sort of classically legal, code-like, systematizing, technical texts, even these texts actually contain more of a story form than they've really been given credit for. And what I really want to argue is that we can problematize the idea that there is even a shield with two sides, as Bialik puts it, or sort of a coin with two sides, two discourses that join together. But to say actually that the apparent two sides of halakhah and aggadah are really more like two sides of a Mobius strip, right? They appear to be distinct, but really once you keep following them, they actually can't be distinguished from each other at all. So that is what I will argue in the rest of our time together. But first, I just want to pause before we get into the nitty-gritty of the Talmud texts and take some Q&A.
Thank you so much for that really full and very nuanced introduction to this dichotomy and non-dichotomy. So we don't have so many questions, although a lot of enthusiasm about what you're talking about. I would say the main questions are kind of coalescing actually about like trying to map these these genres to the extent that they are onto biblical texts. So if you could clarify, for example, like when you're talking about, I think you said this, but just to be totally explicit, when you're talking about midrash halakhah and midrash aggadah, is the genre determined by the biblical text, by the midrash? Meaning, like if you have sort of a more legal text with a more narrative midrash, is that an example where the genres flow, or is there one that's kind of determinative? And just in general, people were asking how much can we use this frame for biblical texts?
Yeah, it's a great question. This particular genre distinction between halakhah and aggadah classically has not been applied to biblical texts. Usually when people use this, they're talking about works that were compiled by the rabbis in like the post destruction of the temple period or later. But it's absolutely true that, like the Babylonian Talmud, the Bible does contain an amalgam of law and literature as well, right? And certainly, right, once we sort of hit Parshat Mishpatim a couple of weeks ago, right? We're moving in the book of Exodus from the story of the Exodus into certainly a more legal section of the Bible. The distinction between midrash halakhah and midrash aggadah is a little bit tricky. So one thing that is interesting about what is typically called midrash halakhah is that the works of midrash halakhah actually only start at the legal portions of the book of Exodus. So they actually don't produce any midrash halakhah on the book of Breshit, Genesis at all, or on the beginning of the book of Shemot that tells the story of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. But what I would say is really more at the core of this distinction between midrash halakhah and midrash aggadah is the form that the midrash itself takes. There is also what's considered to be midrash aggadah on so-called legal sections of the Bible, and it's more that midrash aggadah is produced in a form that would have been given like as a kind of like proto-Dvar Torah in synagogues in the rabbinic period, whereas midrash halakhah is more sort of doing technical, interpretive work, often in the service of deriving some kind of legal rule. But yeah, again, I would say like it wouldn't be wrong to describe some parts of the Torah as halakhic and other parts as more aggadic, so to speak. And there has been interesting, in terms of the scholarly world, there has been really interesting work on also kind of problematizing the extent to which there has been a distinction made between law and narrative. My colleague, Dr. Leanne Feldman, who's a Bible professor at NYU, has written about the fact that actually in the text in Vayikra and in Leviticus that describe the building of the Mishkan and laws around the Mishkan, which are generally sort of thought to be kind of more dry and legal and not to have much of an interesting sort of plot, that there's actually much more narrative there than, again, has been given credit for. So this kind of work is happening in the field of biblical studies too. It's just these terms often aren't used so much there.
Great, thank you. And you're right, we've just it's perfectly timed this session because we've just sort of plunged from the the Genesis and the Exodus narratives into this, as you put it, material, biblical material that we could describe as Talmudic, but there's so much midrash that's not limited in that way. All right, so maybe just one more question for now. So I love that you started with that that kind of trashing of halakhah, what sounded like a trashing of halakhah by Bialik, and then you came back to him in the end to explain the context for that, that he's trying to, he's responding to this long-term privileging of halakhah. So the question is, this isn't really an on one foot question, but can you shed any light on historical, political, sociological, cultural factors that might have made it so that we were the kind of the authorities in the tradition were so much more focused on halakhah than aggadah?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of this is connected, and we'll sort of talk about this a little bit more when we look at the next text. The connection between who is considered to be a scholarly elite and who has practical legal power in Jewish communities. These are often the same people, right? If you think about what sort of rabbis are classically and maybe even now considered to do, right? What do? They study and they also issue, rulings, or they tell people, here's what, you sort of should or shouldn't do in your Jewish life. Hopefully today with some pastoral sense, but just classically, right? That's kind of those are the rabbinic roles. And so I think a big piece of it is just kind of thinking about, okay, well, practically, right, in terms of study curricula, rabbis are going to want to privilege the texts that they're actually going to wind up using in the sphere in which they have power and influence in their communities, right? And that is the legal sphere. I'll also say, I think an interesting kind of cross-cultural element of this is that outside of the Jewish world, traditionally narratives, for example, novels have been associated with women, and that in a more patriarchal context of Jewish text study, right, there may have been a sense that narratives are not kind of for the male scholarly elites, and that law is really sort of the genre in which kind of rabbinic masculine, power and skill is going to be expressed. And I think it's not a coincidence that as the academic study of Talmud has opened up in the second half or second last quarter, let's say, of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st century, to include a lot more people who are not men, that also there's been a refocusing on genres that maybe have not been privileged in a more kind of traditional masculine study setting.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
I mean, I was just about to ask that because someone just anticipated what, that do we think that the rise in interest in narrative is related to more women in scholarship? So you just just took us right there. Let's go back to your material and come back to questions afterwards.
Great. Good. Okay. So as I mentioned, we're now going to turn to an example of what Barry Wimpheimer calls a legal narrative, which is a story about the law or a story that implicates the law in some way. And what we're actually going to see is that these stories treat the law kind of on two levels. One is they contain legal information inherently. And then, as we'll see, the redactor, the person or people who put together passages in the Talmud, who edit and arrange how the Talmud works, are also going to then take these stories, the story that we're going to look at and other stories like it, and try to use it in a legal context. Try to say, actually, these stories, even though they are stories, actually have some kind of legal principle that we should be understanding or deriving from it. And what I want to start with, though, before we look at our story, is more of a sort of what would traditionally be classified as a halakhic text that comes in the Talmud shortly before the stories that we'll be looking at. And what's interesting about this genre of legal stories is that the authors of the Talmud often follow what seem more like purely legal discussions with stories that then actually subvert or reveal problems with the law in some way. And then the authors of the Talmud, the redactors, then try to take these potentially subversive legal stories and figure out how to bring them back into line with the Talmud's broader legal project. And that's exactly what we're going to see happening with the legal text and the story that follows that we're about to look at. So if we could pull up our first text from Sanhedrin 74a. So we have this text, which is somewhat well known, telling us that Rav Yochanan said in the name of Rav Shimon, the son of Yehud they counted and concluded, meaning they sort of took a legal vote in the attic of the house of Nitzah in the city of Lod and determined the following. Regarding all the transgressions in the Torah, if a person is told transgress and you will not be killed, one should transgress and not be killed, except for idol worship, forbidden sexual relations, and murder. Okay, so basically what this text is telling us is that Jewish law values the life of the individual. And so there are only these sort of three cardinal sins, right? Idolatry, problematic sexual relations, and murder, for which one is required to choose death rather than violate these sins. Okay, and the flip side of that is for any other transgression, eating non-kosher meat or violating the Sabbath, anything else where somebody, let's say, some Roman, thug comes and places a sword to your head and says, you got to eat this pork or I'll kill you. The text here in the Talmud says you should go ahead and eat the pork, okay? As long as it's not idolatry, forbidden sex, or murder, your life is considered to be more important to the rabbis than abstaining from any of these, committing any of these sins. Okay, we can pause screen share. Thank you so much, Tony. Okay. So we have this ruling, and just a couple of pages later in the Talmud, we're going to see a story that subverts this ruling in perhaps a surprising way. So Tani, if I could ask you to pull up the next source, and we'll read just the beginning of this source together. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, there is a story of a man who placed his eyes on a woman and his heart filled with black bile. And they came and asked the doctors, and the doctors said he has no treatment unless she has intercourse with him. The sages said, let him die, but she will not have intercourse with him. The doctors said she should stand before him naked. The sages said, let him die, but she will not stand before him naked. The doctors said she should converse with him from behind a barrier. The sages said, let him die, but she will not converse with him from behind a barrier. Okay, so clearly, this story is related to the ruling that we just saw before from Sanhedrin 74a, right, which talks about the tension between somebody's possible death on the one hand and potentially transgressing some kind of, committing some kind of forbidden act from the Torah. On the other hand, right? And clearly, our story is dealing with the issue of illicit sex and the tension between, right, what could be a scenario in which someone might have to choose between death or illicit sex. Okay, so here is this man who is, so lovesick that he's, according to the doctor, is going to die unless he has sex. But you'll notice a few things that place this story in tension with the law that we saw describing the 3 meets vote that are the only ones that you need to keep even on pain of death. Okay, so first of all, it's not clear that sex with the woman in the story would constitute a forbidden sexual act, right? Forbidden sexual acts in the Torah would include sex with a close relative, maybe sex between somebody who's married and somebody who's not married, but we don't know anything about, right, the marital status of any of the people in the story. There's, in fact, no biblical prohibition on premarital sex. That may be the main thing that some of you take away from this talk. But yes, turns out in Judaism, no biblical prohibition on premarital sex. Maybe there's a rabbinic issue. Even that is pretty iffy. So that's one issue. First of all, why are the rabbis telling this person that he has to die rather than commit possibly illicit sexual acts, right? Possibly sexual acts that are totally fine. And we have another issue in this story, which is, right, the doctors who initially say, the only possible treatment for this lovesick man is sex, then kind of back down and they say, okay, well, it could be nudity. It could actually be just chatting. Right? The legal text that we saw that said one must die rather than transgress a sexual prohibition is pretty clearly about intercourse. And our story, right, extends this sin to include various types of sexual or romantic encounters that really fall very far short of intercourse, right? So this story is really at odds with the legal ruling. First of all, because it's not clear that the two main characters are biblically prohibited from each other. And second of all, because there are acts that are prescribed by the doctors as cures that seem like they really wouldn't cross the threshold of acts that justify martyrdom, according to rabbinic law, right? And nonetheless, we have this story in which the rabbis are apparently mandating that this person should martyr himself, essentially, should die, right, rather than do any of these forbidden acts. So why, right? Why do we have a story in which the rabbis are essentially allowing somebody to die even when we had this law that seemed to say, actually, right, it could be fine for the rabbis to allow some of what or all of what the doctors are suggesting. So at least up until this point, right, it seems like this is in some ways a story about rabbinic power. Right, here is a place where the rabbis are asserting their authority against other holders of expertise, these doctors, right, who we don't know who they are, but they're potentially sort of local experts, possibly not Jewish, right? It's also worth noting that this kind of sort of extra legal martyrdom is actually something that has happened in Jewish history. During the Crusades, there were Jewish communities in Europe, in Northern Europe, who chose to martyr themselves rather than submit to the Crusaders. And rabbinic authorities at the time and afterwards kind of struggled about how could they do this, since actually they seemed to be really going against the rabbinic ruling that really only limits legally acceptable martyrdom to 3 specific categories. But it seems like, right, there may also be underlying this story some anxiety about actually, right, in a late antique world, right, in which there are also Christians and martyrdom is actually considered to be a religiously powerful act, right? There may have also been a real sort of wish or tendency to push actually against the restrictions on martyrdom and say, no, sort of, can't we martyr ourselves for more things? But in terms of the rabbinic power piece, I think there's another piece. Not just are the rabbis asserting their power over and against these doctors, but one thing they also seem to be doing is asserting their power by making legal decisions for people that don't just obey the letter of the law, right? The rabbis in this text aren't justifying their legal decision by saying, listen, it says here that we have to do this and we can't do that. They're just saying, listen, let him die. That's just what we're saying. We're in charge here, right? We're able to say that. We don't follow the law. The rabbis in this story are sort of implying the law follows us. We're actually the ones who decide what the law says and what it doesn't, right? So if we read the story this way, it's a story not just about the law in this case, right? Whether or not, people are allowed to die rather than commit illicit acts or vice versa, but it's also a story about the relationship between rabbis and law in general, right? This is a story that claims that it's ultimately the rabbis themselves who decide what the law is going to be. Now, that's what we sort of have, I think, from our read of this first part of the story, right? Up until this point, right, we don't know, as we discussed, whether the woman in the story is married or unmarried. But later rabbis commenting on the story are going to take different opinions about this subject. So back to the text on the screen, Rav Yaakov bar Idi and Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani disagreed about it. One said she was married, and the other said she was unmarried. For the one who said she was married, the story works well, right? And the Talmud is saying that the story works well because, as we discussed, if the woman is married, then sex with this woman falls under the category of a biblically prohibited sexual act. And fine, it works well, meaning it makes sense that the rabbis decreed that this falls into the category of, one of the sins that one should die rather than commit. But for the one who says this, that she was unmarried, what is this all about? So the narrator of the Talmud here is picking up on the fact that it's possible to read this as a story that actually seems to, right, be at odds with the legal ruling that we saw earlier. And what the narrator of the story is going to do is put this text back into the framework of some kind of legally or morally binding tale. So Rav Papa said, because of family shame, Rav Acha, son of Rav Ika, said, so that the daughters of Israel should not be prostituted for illicit sex. So both Rav Papa and Rav Acha, son of Rav Ika, are marshaling explanations that seem to come from outside the law as justifications for the rabbi's ruling, right? One option is, right, we're concerned about shame that's going to come to these people's families, maybe this woman's family, right? Even though it's not a technically forbidden sexual act, right? There's concern for sort of broader social consequences. And so the rabbis were worried about that. Rav Acha, son of Rav Ika, is saying actually what they're really worried about is some kind of consequence in terms of how people in this society are going to see and treat Jewish women, right? If the rabbis are willing to just kind of say, right, this woman should go ahead and have sex with this man who she's not married to, right? Some kind of concern that people are then going to see that Jewish women are sort of available for coerced sex and other consequences, right? And actually that concern is significant enough that, right, in this case, even though it doesn't technically fall under one of the three categories that we saw in the earlier ruling, right, the rabbis are still going to be extremely stringent in how they treat this case. And what's happening here is, right, by drawing on these kind of extra legal, these outside of the law concerns, right, shame or concern about sort of how women are going to be treated, the rabbis here, Rav Papa and Rav Acha, son of Rav Ika, are actually saying, you know what, this is a meaningful, reasonable legal ruling because the rabbis had these other causes for concern. And actually, these are important principles that need to be incorporated into rabbinic rulings. And then the narrator of this text is still not satisfied. So there's pushback now on the rabbis for trying to incorporate these concerns into their ruling and letting somebody die because of it. So the narrator of the story asks, so let him marry her, right? If the whole problem is that she's not married and we have these concerns and it's going to bring shame to her family or shame to other Jewish women, right? Why not just say that the two actors should get married? And the story concludes by saying, no, that wouldn't have worked. That wouldn't have settled the mind of this lovesick man because of something that Rav Yitzchak said. For Rav Yitzchak said that from the day of the destruction of the temple, the flavor of intercourse was taken and given to sinners. As it is written, stolen waters are sweet and bread eaten furtively is tasty. Essentially, Rav Yitzchak says that now that the temple has been destroyed, now that society is in chaos and rabbinic culture is just kind of a mess, people only want the kind of sex that is forbidden to them. People only want what they can't have. And so fundamentally, right, the end of the story says, actually, you thought that this was about rabbinic power. It's actually about rabbinic powerlessness, because the rabbis had no way to resolve the situation. If they had made the sex permitted, the man wouldn't have wanted it anymore, and it wouldn't have helped cure his lovesick malaise. And of course, if they don't permit it, then it's a forbidden act that's going to be a problem for all of these other reasons. And so, in fact, right, in a post-destruction of the temple world, the rabbis have lost their power to really regulate what people do. So we've seen that this is a story not just about the law locally, right? Meaning it's not just about the legal ruling here, whether people should be permitted to transgress in certain contexts or not, or when to save a life or when not to, but it's also a story about the law more generally and the rabbinic relationship with the law, right? First, this sort of fantasy of the rabbis just having the power to rule however they want. And then with their conclusion about, right, people only sort of the stolen waters are sweet, right? People only kind of wanting what's illicit, this kind of throwing hands up in the air and actually saying, really, rabbinic rulings can't help anyone because what people really want is to do what's forbidden to them, right? And so rabbis can rule all they like, but ultimately it's not really going to make any difference in the world. So this is a little taste of a story in the Talmud, right? A story about, right, that contains many kind of classical narrative features, a lovesick man, a dilemma, the sort of threat of, right, something terrible happening to him and how is this going to be resolved? But that also is speaking in some way both to specific legal concerns and to bigger issues of the law as a whole. So what we're going to do next, but first we're going to pause for any more Q&A, is we're then going to see a text that kind of does the reverse of this, right? We just saw a narrative, but actually an aggadah that speaks to legal concerns, and we're going to see some legal texts that actually, I'll argue, contain some really interesting narrative elements. Okay, but I'll just pause, maybe just take one quick question.
Okay. Well, the torrent of comments in response to that text, you might be able to guess, was about the whole missing narrative about the woman and what she wants or doesn't want, and the text's, total lack of concern with that question. So maybe could you kind of address that in the context of, of the other issues you've been talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And again, I think I'm glad that I got the question in the earlier Q&A round about sort of why culturally halakhic texts are being privileged. Look, I think, this legal narrative, again, is really being told, it is a narrative, but it's being told from the perspective of an extremely patriarchal rabbinic context, right? Just people who are concerned, right? They do have a moment of sort of concern for the woman's family shame, or, are women going to be treated badly based on our rulings? But mostly they are concerned about what rulings are permissible, their own power, right? And, what's going to happen to the lovesick man is much more of a pressing concern for them than what happens to the woman here. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, again, right, in a world in which, right, more voices contributed to the formation of the Talmud and the reception of rabbinic literature, I think we would wind up with a Jewish textual canon that looked quite different. And that did maybe contain some of these missing stories. And I think this is something that, again, we're really starting to see in more contemporary writing. But yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It is a story about the law, but the sort of more kind of human piece of the story is absolutely missing.
Thanks. Those 90% of the questions were on that, so I feel like we can leave it there.
Great. Okay. So I want to now turn to our last couple of texts. And I know we're kind of getting to our last kind of third of the session. So let's see how quickly but comprehensively I can run us through these texts. Okay. what we saw in the last passage was how the redactor of the Talmud was sort of trying to take this narrative about the law that was maybe pushing against the law in some ways, and put it back into the framework of legal precedent, and also sort of told a story about rabbinic power versus powerlessness. Now we're going to turn to kind of more traditional kind of halachic technical legal argumentation, and show how there's actually narrative elements there as well. The particular type of passage I'm going to focus on in order to make this point takes the form of what's often called an okimta. So in okimta, this is a technical Aramaic term. It's a form of legal interpretation in the Bavli that tries to resolve some kind of problem with an earlier law by upholding the authority of the earlier law, but coming up with a new, more restrictive interpretation of how it should be applied. So, for example, if there's a rule that anyone who teaches an online course at JTS has to go to the JTS Mincha Minyan afterwards to participate in afternoon prayers, you might say, no, that is a problem. And just to be clear, there's no rule like this. I'm just making this up. Okay, that might be a problem, right? What if the person teaching the online course is teaching from home and they can't go to Mincha? What if they have another meeting at that time? Maybe they're teaching on a week when JTS is on vacation and there is no Mincha Minyan. Okay, so the okimta, this restrictive interpretation, is going to say, no, the rule still holds, but it's just limited in certain ways, right? When it said anyone who teaches an online course for JTS, what it really meant was any teacher who's teaching from campus while school is in session, and only if they don't have some other important conflicting obligation. Okay, so in the Bavli, this form of interpretation is generally applied to some law in the Mishnah, right, or some other earlier source than the Bavli, in order to uphold the authority of that law, while also revising it so that it makes more sense. Sometimes you'll just get like one sort of simple okimtot, like, oh, that law only applies let's say, to women and not men, or something like that. But sometimes you'll see several okimtot in a row, right? Sort of like the example that I just gave, right? Limitations are only someone who's on campus and while school is in session and they don't have some other meeting. And so that type of passage, which I'm calling a multi-step okimta passage, is the type of passage that we'll be talking about. So kinds of passages, I think, contain a sort of hidden type of narrative in them. And in order to understand the kind of narrative I'm going to be talking about, I want you to think about a detective novel. In a detective novel, you have sort of two stories happening at the same time. One story is about a detective who's trying to figure out, right, the details of, let's say, who stole the jewels and why and how, right? And so you have a story of a detective going around saying, maybe it was the butler. No, actually, the butler was framed. It must have been Lady Windsor, whatever. And then there's another narrative that's being told in a detective novel at the same time, which is the story of the crime itself, right? This story isn't told in order, but it's going to be told by the time you reach the end of the book. And by the end of the book, you could put the story in order, right? What really happened was that first Lady Windsor was jealous of Penelope, and so she stole the jewels, and then she framed the butler, whatever. Okay, and so what I think is that these texts, these legal texts in the Talmud that contain these multiple layers of restrictive interpretation, are actually quite similar to a detective story, right? In that they contain two types of narratives. One is the framework of people, in this case, rabbis, rather than detectives, trying to solve a problem. And the other being the case, right? The sort of story of the restrictive interpretation that's going to be generated. Okay, so what am I talking about? Let's look at our first text to see an example. Okay, and what we're going to see highlighted in this example is really the sort of the story of the detectives, or the story of people in the Beit Midrash, rabbis sitting around trying to come up with the right answer to a problem. Okay, so the okimtot, the restrictions here, are going to respond to the following statement in the Mishnah, and I'm now in the text looking at the first line. If an ox gored a man and the man died, if the ox is mu'ad, the owner pays restitution, and if the ox is tam, he is exempt from restitution, and both the former and the latter ox are liable for the death penalty. Okay, so just to unpack some of the terminology here, an ox that is mu'ad is rabbinically defined as an ox that has killed somebody 3 times, so a known killer ox. And a tam ox is any ox that is not mu'ad, so basically just your ordinary innocent ox. These types of oxen appear all over rabbinic legal literature, and they have different legal outcomes associated with them, which makes sense. If I'm the owner of an ox who's known to be super dangerous, and I'm not careful, and the ox kills someone, that's really my fault as an owner. Whereas if I'm the owner of just like a regular ox and I let the ox out and to everyone's surprise, the ox kills someone, that's not really my fault in the same way. And we see that idea played out here exactly in the Mishnah, right? If a mu'ad kills somebody, the owner has to pay restitution. And if it's a tam ox, then they don't, right? They're exempt. But here's the important point for our purposes. Either way, the Mishnah says, if any ox kills someone, both the former ox and the latter ox, doesn't matter if it's tam or mu'ad, that ox has to be put to death. Okay, so the Talmud is now going to come in with a question. If both a tam ox and a mu'ad ox are killed after they kill one person, but a mu'ad ox is an ox that has been known to kill 3 times, how could you ever wind up with a mu'ad ox? How could you get an ox that kills 3 times if after the first time it kills somebody, you are supposed to give that ox the death penalty? Okay, really good question. Mishnah does not seem to make sense here. So in response to this question, we're going to get a whole bunch of different suggestions by different rabbis of the Talmud, right? So Rava is going to say, oh, actually, really, we're talking about in the Mishnah, an ox that they estimated could kill 3 people. Rav Ashi says, no, it's not about estimation. That's really meaningless. What are we dealing with here? Actually, it didn't kill 3 people, but it endangered 3 people. Rav Zavid said, no, it didn't kill 3 people, it killed 3 animals, okay? And the assumption is we don't put oxen to death for killing animals, right? Only people. Now we reject that statement, right? Because an ox that's known to kill 3 animals isn't necessarily expected to kill a person. And then a new suggestion by Rav Shimi, the ox killed 3 non-Jews. And again, the assumption is that oxen wouldn't get the death penalty for that, right? And so we have problematic killings, but not necessarily the death penalty. Okay, troubling as that may be, we'll have to bracket the question of what to do with that and save it for another talk. So again, another rejection of this and a new suggestion by Reish Lakish, and that suggestion is rejected, and so on until the end of our passage. I'm not going to go into the content of the rest of the suggestions because it's actually not important for our purposes. What's important is that we're seeing how the structure of the passage works, right? We have our problem motivating our detectives, our rabbis, to try to come up with some kind of answer. And then, right, the story of the search for the solution. First, Rava tries to solve the problem, but it doesn't work. Then Rav Ashi tries to solve the problem, and that doesn't work, and so on. Okay, so that's our first example of this kind of passage, right, that focuses on the story of people trying to solve a logical problem with an earlier text. And we're just going to look at one more text, which is a little bit more of a complex multi-step okimta. And what we're going to see here is that we still have the detective story framework, a bunch of rabbis trying to solve a problem. But the okimtot, the way in which they come up with a new narrative to explain the Mishnah, is going to then generate its own narrative, actually a very detailed and complex new case scenario. So this passage appears in a chapter that has to do with the laws of unintentional murder. So just some quick legal background for this passage. According to several sources in the Bible, if somebody kills somebody else by accident, the killer flees to a city of refuge. The rabbis of the Talmud are very concerned with the idea of what exactly counts as unintentional murder, that actually the murderer has to be just at the right level of unintentionality, culpable enough that they deserve to basically be incarcerated in the city of refuge, but also faultless enough that they don't deserve to be treated as sort of a regular murderer, but that they deserve the kind of protections the city of refuge offers. And so because they have kind of this complicated notion of exactly the right level of unintentionality, it means that some of the rulings in the Mishnah about who does or doesn't go to the city of refuge don't make sense today. So that's what's going on in this passage. The Mishnah says, if someone throws a stone into the public domain and thus kills, behold, this person is exiled to the city of refuge. Now, for the rabbis of the Talmud, right, this is a person who is culpable enough that they don't deserve the protection that the city of refuge offers, right? If I throw a stone into Times Square and it kills somebody, and then I'm like, whoops, I didn't know that it would do that. Oh no, right? The rabbis would say, that's really ridiculous. And in fact, you are culpable. You don't count as an unintentional murder. So again, the Talmud is going to respond to this problem with some multi-step limitations, okimtot, on the Mishnah's rule. So first we have a statement by Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, who said, actually, when the Mishnah said somebody threw a stone, what they were really talking about was somebody who was knocking down his stone wall. Okay, the Talmud then rejects this suggestion. And then we have a statement by Rav Papa, who is going to say that actually what happened is the stone thrower was throwing stones into a garbage heap where people usually go to the bathroom at night, but not during the day. And that day, somebody happened to come there and go to the bathroom. And what happens in this passage is that actually this first statement from a rabbi named Shmuel Bar Yitzchak becomes connected in the intervening text with the statement by Rav Papa and turns into a new, complex, unified rereading of the Mishnah and really one new long hypothetical case, right? And what the rabbis wind up concluding in this passage is that when the Mishnah said somebody threw a stone in public, what it's really talking about is a person who's knocking down a stone wall into a garbage heap where people sometimes go to the bathroom at night, but not during the day. But someone happened to show up there to go to the bathroom during the day, and the stone hit him, and he died, and the stone thrower got sent to the city of refuge, the end. So this is basically its own short story. We have a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? We even have a kind of plot twist, right? Everyone thought that no one went to the bathroom in the garbage heap during the day, but surprise, somebody showed up. So why is this important? I know this is very technical, and I appreciate you bearing with me with these very sort of complex and legal reinterpretations. So, right, we're winding up again with these passages that seem to be dealing with legal minutia, but really are telling these two types of stories, right? One is the story of rabbis looking for a solution, the other being, right, this whole hypothetical case scenario, which turns into its own kind of story. And I think what we get from this is a new sense of what it means to talk about a legal passage in the Talmud. Right? that what we're seeing here is that when the rabbis are talking about the law, they're not just talking about codes and statutes, but they're also dealing with issues of playing with ideas, trying to understand the way people work, creating compelling textual worlds, and I think also modeling for us what it looks like for a community of scholars to reconcile difficulties that they have with earlier canonical sources, right? They show how far the rabbis of the Talmud are willing to go in constructing a narrative that weaves together thinkers from different generations, producing complex and creative new stories when the situation requires it. And I think they also just model what it looks like to engage seriously with Jewish texts and ideas. I think this has import for another question I've been thinking about a lot recently, which is the idea of commandedness. And this is another plug for my class in March on mitzvot, and the role of halakhah and obligation in our lives today. Alyssa Gray, who's a scholar of rabbinic literature who teaches at HUC, the Reform Rabbinical School downtown, says that the literature of the halakhah, right, can and must be taken seriously as part of the Jewish people's canon of great literature, right? So this implies, she says, a Jewish obligation, not necessarily to follow halakhah, but to read the Jewish canon, including the halachic canon, to take it seriously, right? Not just as statutes, but as part of the textual tradition that informs the way we think, what we think about, and what it looks like to be part of a community of Jewish readers. Okay, pause there and take, well, because I won't pause. I'll stop there and I'll take any last questions, maybe one last question in the last minute.
Okay, great. Yeah, so let's go back to a question from earlier, since we just have so little time. There was a question about if folks more further to the right on the religious spectrum might view the issues that you're talking about in the same way, with sort of a traditional Orthodox view, embrace the kind of blurring that you're talking about, or is that something that's ideologically fraught today, or not so much? You can answer that in 5 seconds or so.
Sure. I think some of what I'm doing is based in sort of a scholarly tradition of people thinking about how the Talmud was very consciously crafted. I think that is to some extent a little bit controversial, just in the sense of, really thinking of somebody putting the Talmud together for reasons other than this is how it was given to Moshe at Sinai. But I also think that the idea that the Talmud was put together by editors who were humans and kind of had their own ideas of how they wanted us to read or think about these texts, does appear in also classical commentary. So it's not like, it's an idea that scholars of the 20th century sort of invented out of thin air. So I think, it can be reconciled with more traditional ideas, but there may also be a little bit of tension in terms of what's tradition and what's kind of the human hand.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for teaching us today, and for kind of, breaking open what we might be inclined to think of in an overly simplistic way, but really, right, as in life, the same with Jewish texts. We can't just sort of put neat boxes around it saying, here are the rules, here's how we live our lives. It's really, they're really inextricably enmeshed. So thank you for just taking us through that, both with kind of a conceptual framework up front and then reading it into the text afterwards. And again, everyone, if you want 4 more sessions with Professor Wolf on the question of of obligation and free choice. We have the online course that Ellie has just posted in the chat. And actually, Rabbi Gordon Tucker is teaching us a week from today on that very same topic. So there's the one session version and then the in-depth version with Professor Wolf coming up. Thanks everyone for joining us. Hope to see you next week. And thank you once again to Dr. Wolf for teaching us today.
Thanks so much.